who occupied the presidential palace. It's approaching midday in Grozny, and this is the very center of the city. The presidential palace is behind me. The Russians claim they control it. It's obviously not the case. In the hour we spent here, there was sporadic shelling and sniper fire all around the city, but the presidential palace did not take any direct hits. The central square was strewn with the wreckage of Russian tanks and the bodies of soldiers. They were the only Russians we saw, despite Moscow's claims that it had the presidential palace surrounded and its forces were patrolling parts of the city. As we've seen today, Russia appears a long way from being the victor in this war despite its might. Chechen fighters vow they'll continue even if Grozny falls. The losses are being suffered by civilians, a plight symbolized by this woman alone in the central square with an unexploded shell beside her. Andrew Simmons, ITN in Grozny.
Here, fired at hundreds.
The Chechens are counter-attacking, pushing Russian forces back from the center of Grozny with astonishing success. Here, Russian snipers had been spotted high up in a building. Chechen rebels tried to flush them out, and we found ourselves in the middle of a firefight. But then we managed to reach Grozny's central square and its presidential palace, where these Chechen fighters were jubilant. Against all the odds, they had repelled the Russian advance and destroyed several tanks and armored cars. We counted the bodies of at least half a dozen Russian soldiers. Well, I'm now standing in front of the presidential palace. This building is the very symbol of Chechen independence, and it's why there's been some of the most ferocious fighting between the two sides here. The Chechen leader, Jokhar Dudayev, had not been seen for several days, but tonight he appeared on television to appeal for talks on a ceasefire. President Dudayev claimed that his men now hold hundreds of Russian prisoners of war. He said they could be executed at any time. But already the corpses of young Russian soldiers are piling up in Grozny, and soon even Boris Yeltsin may wonder whether this fight is really worth it. For now, though, the Russian bombardment goes on. The Chechens are living in a state of high tension, and sometimes they even argue amongst themselves. Amidst all the shelling, this woman simply sits outside the presidential palace, in shock and in the line of fire. While a few yards away, Chechen fighters salvage spare parts from a tank they've hit. Another one they've captured will now be used in the cause of Chechen independence. The rebels here are rapidly growing in confidence, and they sense they may yet defeat the mighty Russian army. Ben Brown, BBC News, Grozny.
Fire has destroyed the former...
Protected by Israeli troops worked on clearing the site that Arab villagers say is theirs. The Israeli cabinet was deep in debate, and it went on all day. Mr. Rabin told Parliament that under no circumstances would building be allowed to continue at the controversial site. But he held open to the settlers the offer of a compromise to allow them to build on a hill closer to their existing settlement of Efrat. They've not agreed yet. They want written undertakings and their right to build anywhere in Israeli-occupied territory acknowledged.
This is, in my opinion, a pragmatic solution. It gives a message that we are sensitive to the interests of our partners, Palestinian partners, and on the other hand, it does not give up our vital interests.
But it won't satisfy the Palestinians, who object to any expansion of settlements, saying it's a violation of the peace deal.
I am sorry to say that continuing the settlement activity in this area and in the other areas of the West Bank, as it was revealed in the last days, is dangerous for the whole peace process.
In future, all plans to expand settlements will be vetted by a cabinet committee, the implication being that the lower level body had let too much through, causing this crisis of the peace process. Alex Brody, BBC News, Jerusalem.
The Bosnian...
Ice and drifting snow, treacherous conditions for drivers in much of the country today. The hazardous sub-zero temperatures led to speed restrictions on some motorways, but it was on side roads where motorists suffered most. It wasn't all misery, though. Children in Norfolk enjoyed the first snow of the winter. 3 inches fell last night, the New Year holiday making up for the lack of a white Christmas. Along the east coast, flood warnings issued earlier by the National Rivers Authority were lifted, but high winds and strong tides made a gas drilling rig unstable. 16 workers were rescued by air. In South Shields, mountainous waves crashed onto the coastline, buffeting sea defences and causing some structural damage. Although milder weather's on the way, for most of Britain, this is the bitterest night of the winter so far, and a turbulent start to 1995. Nicola Carslaw, BBC News.
Tonight's main news again, the head of the...
Chechen rebels celebrated their success today in keeping control of Grozny's presidential palace, but the Russians have other ideas. We had just started filming at the palace when it came under intense shell fire.
Well, we've just pulled back from the presidential palace. We're now about 1 kilometre away, and as you can hear, there's a massive artillery bombardment of the building going on right now.
But every time the Russians go on the offensive, the Chechens hit back. Today we saw more heavy street fighting in the center of Grozny. It's David against Goliath, and the Chechens, outnumbered and outgunned, have the upper hand purely because of their exceptionally high morale and motivation. The Russians, though, have the advantage of air supremacy, and this afternoon they used it to try and crush rebel resistance in the Chechen countryside. On the ground, the result was death and devastation. When we arrived in the little village of Shali, we found a market had been completely destroyed. The Chechens say as many as 100 people were killed or injured here. But aerial attacks on civilian targets like this are hardly going to win the war for Russia. This man told me that his cousin died in the air raid. The people here, he says, were peaceful. They were poor and just trying to make some money in this market. A few miles away, a simple tractor had been hit. The victims are said to have been a man and a boy. The Russian army are now more than 3 weeks into this war, and they're digging in for a long Caucasian campaign. It took the army of the Tsars decades to suppress the Chechen people. Russia's defense minister has boasted that this time it would need only a few days, but already he's been proved wrong. Ben Brown, BBC News, Chechnya.
Despite President Yeltsin's attempts to win public backing for his Chechen campaign, images of dead Russian soldiers on the streets of Grozny are now reaching Russian television viewers. Tonight, a delegation of Russian members of parliament returned to Moscow from Chechnya and urged the president to halt the assault on Grozny and resume talks with Chechen leaders.
The reality of what's happening in Chechnya is beginning to get through to Russian television viewers. Graphic shots of dead Russian soldiers are now being shown on news bulletins, and public discomfort is growing.
I can't bear to watch the TV anymore. I used to believe in Yeltsin, but now I don't trust him.
I voted for him at the start, but now I realize he is a traitor surrounded by criminals.
Demonstrators were out on the streets of Moscow today, reflecting a new opinion poll which shows that 63% of the population is against the military operation. Many people want the Russian troops to pull out of Chechnya immediately, but they know that's unlikely to happen.
The problem is that the government has gone too far already, and in order to stop fighting, they have at least to record some results to say this was a victory, this was a task of the whole operation, be it just having control over Grozny or anything else. But I'm afraid they would not withdraw before achieving any obvious results in this fighting.
The Boris Yeltsin of today appears stiff and formal and rather unwell, much like one of the old Soviet leaders. The image is in stark contrast to the energetic Yeltsin of 3 years ago, when he climbed onto a tank outside the White House and set Russia on course towards democracy. His critics claim his flirtation with democratic principles is over. They include some of his former close allies, men like the ex-Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar. He says the Chechen operation could be followed by a military takeover in Moscow, and he wants the West to act.
I'm sure that what happens in Chechnya now is far away from being the Russian internal business. The scale of the casualties